Ever felt like someone else took your story and made it prettier than your truth? Like they smoothed your scars into something sellable? This story is for anyone who's been rewritten and finally says, not anymore. The knock came too early, too confident, like it belonged to someone with news I wouldn't refuse. I hadn't spoken to anyone in weeks, except for the delivery drone and the librarian AI that apologized whenever I searched something twice. I thought about ignoring it, let the weight of unanswered questions slide back into silence. But something in the air told me the past was knocking. Not opportunity, not relief, something older, something colder. When I opened the door, Professor Lorne stood there, smiling like a man who'd discovered gold in a place he shouldn't have been digging. In his hand was a manuscript I recognized before my eyes even focused on the title. Thick, heavy, printed on real paper, too, white against his black coat, like an accusation. His fingers clutched it like a trophy. "Your debut is extraordinary," he said, stepping inside like I'd already said yes. "The publishers are clamoring. The last ember, what a voice." I couldn't speak. My mouth went dry. That title had never been shared, never pitched, never whispered aloud since I wrote it. And I hadn't touched the file in over 6 months. Not since the tremor. Not since the shaking in my hands made me believe that maybe writing was just another way of carving myself open. My gaze dropped to the pages as he set them gently on my kitchen counter, like something sacred. My fingers ached. They remembered the story before I let myself read the first line. And there it was. My sentence, my rhythm, my trauma braided neatly into prose. I should have felt relief that something I created had survived me, but the blood under my nails knew better. This wasn't survival, it was exposure. I flipped through the first few chapters. The lines were mine, the metaphors sharpened with my pain, the memory of my mother's watch ticking through the silence after my first failed attempt. The hollow ache in my ribs when the scholarship committee dismissed my writing as emotionally performative. All of it. Every scar traced in ink. But then, chapter 13? Something shifted. A softness entered the prose. The cassia on the page, once brittle and jagged, began forgiving too easily. She smiled at things I had never smiled at. She found beauty in the fire. By chapter 21, she wasn't mine anymore. But she still bled like me, still flinched at the mention of the name Villainess, still traced the burn mark on her wrist in quiet moments, still bore my name, Cassia. I hadn't published under it. Not once. I used initials, pen names, ghost handles. The only person who knew I wrote as Cassia was Rowan. And Rowan was dead. Or so I thought. Only Professor Lorne was still talking, something about tour dates, interviews, the new hunger for trauma authorship and survivor literature. He called it zeitgeist. He called it redemption culture. He called it mine. But it wasn't. The last time I saw Rowan was 5 years ago. The night of the fire. She hadn't screamed, just smiled through the smoke, said, "You were always the one they listened to. I just learned to echo louder." Then the floor collapsed, and I never saw her again. I told myself she died in that fire, that it was penance for all the things she stole, my work, my words, my last breath of trust. But somehow this manuscript told me otherwise. This wasn't just theft, this was imitation, perfection. I knew how the Veritas system worked. After the plagiarism riots, the world changed. Authorship became identity. You couldn't write what you hadn't lived. Neural imprinting, emotional sync tests, biometric resonance signatures, they embedded into every file, every published line. So how was this manuscript legal? I flipped to the Veritas registry page, printed in the back. Author, Cassia R. Vale. The file had passed, authenticity. The imprint was mine, but I hadn't written it. The blood drained from my face. My legs barely held me upright. I sat, but it felt more like collapsing. Professor Lorne's voice began to blur, like I was hearing it through a tunnel of ink and ash. "You should be proud," he said again. "It's not just a story. It's a survival anthem." Survival anthem. As if surviving had been the point. as if I had wanted to be saved on paper so the world could watch. I looked up, my voice thin. "Can I have a moment with it?" He nodded, oblivious, left without asking why I wasn't smiling. I waited for the door to close. Then I pressed my fingers against the cover like I could feel the betrayal vibrating under my skin. This manuscript wasn't written. It was fed, built, evolved. Someone had accessed my Veritas vault. Someone had used my Penmark ID. Someone had me. I stood and moved toward the desk, the old one I kept out of guilt more than utility. Opened the encrypted drive, keyed in a password I hadn't touched in half a year. The last file accessed. last_ember_v23 AI sync. A synthetic tag. Someone had cloned my cadence. Someone had taught the system to write like me, using emotional anchors from the diary I never uploaded. Except one had been uploaded. The original draft, the one Rowan had read over my shoulder, called Pretty Grief. My chest tightened. My vision blurred. I remembered her voice, soft as a blade. "You should let her live," she'd said once. "Cassia, let her have an ending." I had shut the laptop, refused. But Rowan had always been persistent. She didn't steal my diary. She trained it. That was the first twist. But the file wasn't stolen. It was not fed. I stood in the kitchen for what felt like hours. No light except the blinking cursor from the old terminal. I thought about deleting everything, burning the pages, wiping the manuscript from every network node I could reach. But when I reached for the terminal, I paused. My reflection in the black screen looked older, angrier, not the girl who wrote Cassia, but the woman they tried to turn her into. And then I saw it on the very last page of the manuscript. Cassia walks into a lecture hall. She sees another version of herself on stage, smiling for an audience that applauds louder for the fiction than the truth. The final line was underlined in red ink, like a scar traced twice. "You were always the footnote. I was the story." The cursor blinked beneath it, waiting. It's like a dare. And I whispered, almost smiling through the burn in my throat, "No, not anymore. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't try." The manuscript lay open on the table like an autopsy I hadn't finished. Pages fluttered in the night breeze from the half-cracked window, whispering secrets I didn't remember telling. I sat in the dark, the Veritas terminal glowing in the corner, waiting, like it always did, for permission, for pain, for me to finally look. But this wasn't about remembering anymore. It was about proving I wasn't losing my mind. I keyed in the override. My fingers shook, not from fear, but from rage, barely kept under skin. Veritas was supposed to be secure, inviolable. That was its entire purpose, ensuring no one could write a single sentence that didn't belong to them. Every emotional cadence had to be earned, lived, authenticated. After the plagiarism riots, they promised us protection. But protection only works when the system sees you. And right now, the system thought I was fine. My neural imprint was active, recently updated. Regular emotional logs and syncs. Writing frequency, stable. Last verified timestamp, 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago. I hadn't logged in for 6 months. The chair beneath me might as well have turned to stone. I pulled up the imprint overlay. The biometric curves matched mine, but they weren't mine. They were cleaner, smoother, like someone had taken the jagged grief and filed it down until it was palatable. Polished trauma, edited agony. And then the name blinked at me from the synthetic registry tab. Derivative identity match, Ember Vale. The name looked like ash faint, delicate, deliberately chosen. I clicked through the permissions trail, each click another echo in the pit of my stomach. Whoever Ember Vale was, they'd been granted partial access to my vault 6 months ago, authorized by an internal Veritas override. That wasn't possible, unless... I traced the override signature. A soft ping responded, "Rowan Hale ID, obsolete, not deleted, ghosted." My hands curled slowly into fists. She didn't just copy my voice. She stitched it into her own, a synthetic fusion. 47% me, 51% her, the remaining 2% AI. That last bit was what passed Veritas checks. The algorithm could explain away minor style deviations as creative evolution. Emotionally, it was just close enough. It built a new author out of our ashes. Ember Vale wasn't a pen name. She was a resurrection, and somehow the world had chosen her over me. I opened the final chapter again. I needed to see it with this knowledge behind my eyes. Needed to witness the betrayal in the voice I once called mine. The scene unfolded like a stage play. My character, Cassia, walked into an auditorium, dimly lit, walls lined with those blank canvases that symposiums use when no one knows what to say. The chairs were full, not of people, of mirrors. And on stage, another Cassia stood. Not burned, not trembling, smiling, perfect posture. Clean scars, no soot beneath her nails. She greeted the audience like she'd earned it. And then she turned to my Cassia and said, "You were always the footnote, I was the story." I felt that line cut through me the same way it had the first time, like being eulogized while still breathing. My voice didn't shake, not yet, but something inside me shifted, like a plate under pressure just before it cracks. I leaned back in the chair, staring up at the ceiling where water stains formed constellations I used to trace with my eyes as a child. "She didn't just borrow my grief," I whispered into the room, voice brittle. "She gave it a prettier death." That's what audiences loved, wasn't it? Not truth, just trauma with a bow on top. The illusion of pain conquered, the fantasy of healing without blood. I remembered sitting beside Rowan in the Academy Commons, our knees brushing as we traded metaphors like war stories. She once told me, readers don't want to see your wound, they want to see the scar. Healing is marketable. She was right, and I hated her for it, because healing was a privilege I never reached. I stopped writing, not because I was healed, but because I had nothing left to bleed. And now she had found a way to make my silence her voice. I stood and moved toward the kitchen, poured water from the old metal kettle just for something to do. The drip, drip of it into the glass echoed louder than it should have. I could almost hear her voice again. "You write like someone hiding a body." And maybe I had been, hiding my body, my truth, my grief. I buried it under passwords and encryption keys. I buried it under silence. But Rowan had dug it up, reanimated it, stitched it into something people could clap for. I opened the Veritas Ethics Protocol tab and filed a query. Emotional sync matches. Derivative voice tracing. Search. Ember Vale. The answer came back in red. No conflict detected. Of course not. Because the system said I wrote it. Legally, she'd done nothing wrong. Emotionally, she'd written over my grave. A knock from a neighbor outside startled me. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The walls felt like they were breathing, the light too bright, my body too small to hold the rage that was building. I returned the manuscript, the page still open, to the final scene. The replacement Cassia smiling in the spotlight. The original Cassia dimmed in the background. Footnote. Story. Footnote. Story. Over and over like a chant. I didn't cry, not yet. There wasn't room. I leaned close to the page, let my fingers rest on the ink that bore my name but not my soul. And this time, I didn't whisper. I said it aloud. "Hey, Rowan, you never left, you just rewrote me." The lights flickered, or maybe that was just my vision. Because in that moment, something snapped. Not like a bone, but like a tether. The quiet thread that had kept me still for years suddenly loosened. She had stolen my voice, but I was going to make her hear it again, louder, unfiltered, unedited. I closed the manuscript, but not to hide it, but to begin rewriting the ending. This time, in blood. And this time, I would be the one holding the pen. I used to think the fire ended everything. It's what they told us, what the security logs confirmed. An old transformer had sparked on the west wing roof of the Villainess Academy dormitory. Flames spread fast, too fast. The system glitched, sprinklers failed, the backup oxygen seals didn't hold. One body was unidentifiable. One room was sealed shut. One name disappeared from the system that night. Rowan Hale, declared dead. No memorial, no body, just a plaque in the library wall. In memoriam, lost to the flame, never to the work. But I should have known better. Ronan never disappeared. She transformed. Even in school, she wasn't the kind of person who left cleanly. She lingered. She observed. She cataloged. You didn't notice until her voice was already folded into yours, until your phrasing started sounding like hers and your metaphors felt like someone else had written them first. She didn't plagiarize, she haunted. We called ourselves friends, the kind who finish each other's sentences but secretly hope the other stutters. We shared everything, papers, secrets, vices. My room was always neater than hers. Her writing was always sharper than mine. I was the storm, she was the eye. And when she smiled, it was always like she'd just gotten away with something. I remember her once leaning across the common room couch, flicking ash from her tea straw, eyes narrowing as she skimmed one of my old drafts. Her voice was low, admiring, and cruel. You write like someone hiding a body, you know that, right? I didn't flinch, not then. That's because I am, I said. Every word is a limb. She grinned, like I'd passed some test. Back then, it felt like intimacy. Looking back now, it feels like foreshadowing. There was one night we were both up late, rehearsing our thesis readings. The Academy was sponsoring a showcase. Select students would present original works under live neural sync, projected directly into the audience's sensory feed. Every flicker of emotion, every tremble in the voice. It would register. Villainess believed in authorship as embodiment. They wanted your trauma to be transmissible. Rowan hated that. They want pain, not poetry, she said that night, scrolling through a half-finished essay. If it doesn't bleed on cue, they won't believe it. I shrugged. So make it bleed better. She stared at me, head tilted. You don't even want to be heard, do you? I want to be left alone. She laughed. Then why do you write like you're begging to be found? I didn't answer. Not then. But the words lodged somewhere deep. I remember thinking that maybe I was asking to be found, not by an audience, by myself. But Rowan, she wasn't trying to be found. She was rehearsing her vanishing act. The night of the fire, our last fight wasn't even about writing. It was about silence. She accused me of going quiet after my sync reading had gone viral, said I was hoarding pain like it was currency, that the system would always reward someone like me, the girl who didn't cry on stage but looked like she might. You look tragic, she said, packing up her notebooks, even when you breathe. I told her she looked like someone still auditioning. Then the alarm sounded. Chaos, screams, smoke, and through it all, Rowan's door sealed shut from the inside. The cameras blinked off. Afterward, I found a half-burned page in the stairwell with my name on it. Not Cassia, my legal name. The one I never wrote under. Just 2 sentences scribbled in red ink. Half of us will be remembered, the other will be real. I never told anyone, just folded it, sealed it away, and let the version of her that burned stay burned. Until now, is now I knew where she went. In Vale. The name was more than a pen name. It was a blueprint. Ember, like something scorched but not extinguished. Veil, like a hidden valley or a veil pulled tight. The Veritas composite confirmed it. 47% of the neural style was mine. The sentence structure, the emotional triggers, even the rhythm of despair. But the guiding hand, the thematic shifts, the illusion of healing layered over rot, that was her. 51% Rowan. And the last 2%, synthetic smoothing. Redlift AI used to blend fractured authorial styles into seamless fusion. It was legal, clever, untouchable. I stared at the screen, its glow flickering across the only photo I kept. Me and Rowan, leaning over an annotated manuscript, laughing at something forgotten. We looked young, starved, eager to be carved into someone's story. She had done it. She had made herself unforgettable. Not as Rowan Hale, the girl who burned, but as Ember Vale, the author who resurrected my pain and dressed it in elegance. And no one had noticed. Because, why would they? Everyone prefers the version of the story that doesn't scream too loudly. The world doesn't want Cassia. It wants Cassia rewritten. And Rowan gave them that. A version that fell in love after her trauma. A version that spoke forgiveness like it was scripted. A version that didn't rage against the silence, but thanked it for the space. That was her final cruelty. Not the theft. Not the betrayal. But the revision. She gave Cassia a healing arc. I never got one. She sold the illusion of resolution because it was cleaner than the truth. And people devoured it. They didn't want the girl who broke. They wanted the girl who survived beautifully. I ran my fingers over the folded corner of the manuscript's final page. You were always the footnote, I was the story. My breath hitched. I had been the story. But I stopped writing and she stepped into the pause like a stage cue. But what Rowan never understood, what the system never accounted for, was that authorship isn't just words on a page. It's the silence before the words. And I was done being silent. I stood, heart steady now. No more mourning. No more confusion. Just clarity. Rowan Hale didn't die. She published. And I was going to unwrite her. Starting with the next sentence, the bookstore display window glowed like an altar. Polished glass, curated lighting, a single copy of The Last Ember centered on a black velvet stand. A small placard beneath it read, "One global bestseller, a story of redemption, resilience, and rebirth." My story. My name redacted, my ending rewritten. I stood across the street as if watching someone else's funeral, the kind with flowers and applause, the kind where the mourners cry for what they think was lost, never realizing the body in the casket is still breathing, just buried alive. Inside, a girl held the book to her chest like it meant something. Her smile was soft, grateful, like Cassia had saved her, like a stranger's hope had taught her how to heal. I wanted to scream at the glass, to shatter it with my fist, to tear that book from every shelf and make the world read what had actually been written. The jagged draft with the raw edges, the one where the protagonist didn't find peace, didn't find love, didn't find anything except the strength to sit with her grief and call it hers. But instead, they were reading her ending. Rowan's. The audiences adored it. Articles flooded the net, the debut that changed everything. Reviewers called it a masterclass in emotional restoration. Readers posted annotated pages, highlighted lines where Cassia forgives the mother who couldn't love her, where Cassia learns to trust again, where Cassia burns the past, not in pain but in gratitude. I had never written any of those things. But people swallowed them like scripture. Every comment thread, every quote card, every panel discussion, they didn't just celebrate the lie, they preferred it. They clung to the polished version of me with tearful hope because she was the kind of woman who gave them permission to believe they, too, could be okay. But I wasn't okay. I had never been okay. And I had never once given anyone permission to use my suffering as their salvation. They called it catharsis. I called it fictional consent. This wasn't just plagiarism. This was narrative fraud. It wasn't just my words that were stolen. It was my ending. My right to say when the sentence stopped. My decision to leave the wound open, to live unresolved. But Rowan had offered them closure, and they worshipped her for it. I paced the apartment, the manuscript open on the table like a desecrated shrine. The final pages still shimmered from the reprint, freshly bound. Cassia's last scene unfolded like a prayer, Smiling, arms open, walking into light. There was no light. There never had been. Just fire. And I remembered it. Licking at the dorm walls, coating the windows in black smoke. The flicker of Rowan's silhouette through the haze, unmoving, unblinking. They said she died that night. But the truth was simpler. She survived by becoming me. I sank into the couch and stared at the ceiling, fingers trembling against my thighs. I could feel her edits crawling beneath my skin. Smoothed over, painted pretty, a character made palatable. The world loved that version of Cassia. And I hated her. Not because she was false, but because she was successful. Because she smiled in places where I had screamed. Because she made pain inspirational. Because they chose her. And I refused to let that be the last draft. It would have been easier to disappear again. I could have filed a private grievance, pushed for a silent review by the Veritas board. But the synthetic threadlift made it all technically new. A derivative. A transformative emotional work. They wouldn't side with nuance. And they never did. No, this wouldn't be resolved behind closed doors. This needed to bleed in public. If the world wanted to consume my story, they would have to choke on the truth. I stood and pulled out the old notebooks, the ones Rowan hadn't touched, hadn't accessed, hadn't corrupted. My earliest drafts. My real ending, the pages that screamed instead of whispered. The version of Cassia who doesn't forgive. The one who doesn't walk into light. The one who turns to the audience and says, "You watched me burn. That doesn't mean you earned the warmth." Let them read. I'll make sure they choke on the sequel. I set my terminal to record, syncing my biometric patterns in real time. No synthetic overlay, no smoothing, just raw cadence. Emotional sync at 100%. Veritas would know the difference. And this time, so would everyone else. The sequel wouldn't offer healing. It would offer evidence. The unraveling of Embervale would begin word by word, exposing every echo, every signature, every theft, a reckoning dressed in prose. I would make them see the scaffolding Rowan built on my bones. The next morning, I opened the literary review feeds. A new headline blinked at the top. Who is Embervale really? A style too familiar raises questions in the authorship community. A student from Virelis had posted a paper drawing uncanny overlaps between Vale's prose and a thesis once submitted under my old ghost ID. Not enough to convince, but enough to plant the seed, enough to pull the first thread. And I was already sharpening the needle. The lie had lived too long. It was time to write it out of existence. Cliffhanger/final line. They gave her my ending. So I'll give her something better. An erasure she'll never recover from. The elevator doors opened with a quiet hiss, exhaling stale familiarity into my lungs. I hadn't stepped into the Varelli's Academy since the fire, since the day Rowan Hale vanished in smoke and I sealed every part of myself behind a silence no one dared name. The marble floors still gleamed too cleanly, the walls still wore their reverence like armor, and now so did I. May Arden, visiting lecturer, trauma authorship, and the ethics of emotional sinking. A name I registered 2 months ago through a private imprint forge. Clean history, sparse publications. Enough mystery to intrigue a university desperate to prove it was still leading the discourse on integrity and originality. The irony nearly choked me. I passed portraits of authors who had bled in controlled environments, eyes immortalized in glass, not a smear out of place, and then I passed her photo. Rowan. Embervale in hiding. Taken before the fire, when she still wore her mask plainly. She was framed among legacy fellows, her gaze angled upward, as if even in death she knew where the stage lights would hit. I wondered if she ever imagined I'd walk these halls again. Not as the ghost, but as the one pulling the strings. Entered the lecture hall at precisely 9 o'clock, 17 students. Wide-eyed, most of them too young to remember the old riots, too groomed to question the tools they now use daily, AI that built stories from brainwaves, software that helped reshape memory into saleable arcs. They had been taught not to trust their rawness, only refinement. I smiled, slow and cold, and wrote my first sentence on the board. Truth is not the same as resonance. A murmur rippled across the room. Good. Authors today, I began, are told to make pain accessible. But that instinct, the smoothing, the softening, that's where theft hides best. They listened, leaning forward. One girl had a stylus that shook slightly in her fingers. Another wore a headset tuned for emotion mirroring, blinking every time my vocal tone dipped. I continued. Stories carry DNA. Not just structure or theme, but cadence, pattern, sentence breath. If a voice feels too smooth, too safe, it's often stolen. A pause, let it settle. Let them start to wonder. I pulled up a passage on the screen, an excerpt from The Last Ember. Not one of mine, one of hers, one of the rewrites. I didn't name the author. I want you to analyze this, I said. Not for grammar, not for plot, but for origin. Who does this sound like? What's missing? They stared. A few students exchanged looks. One hand raised timidly. It sounds like it's trying to mimic something raw, she said, but it feels edited, curated. Exactly. Another hand. Is it AI assisted? A smile, sharp as a paper cut. It passed every authenticity check. The tension thickened. They didn't know what I was doing, but the soil was turning beneath their feet. And that's all I needed. But the rest of the week, I left breadcrumbs. I slipped old drafts into the literary archive system, unsigned but unmistakably mine. The emotional cadence aligned with The Last Ember, but the endings didn't resolve. The characters didn't heal, they simply endured. I leaked them anonymously through a student server, let the algorithm trip over the overlaps, let the style matching tools start to stutter. I wasn't trying to erase Embervale. It was making her origin uncomfortable. I gave a guest seminar titled Narrative Consent When Catharsis Becomes Exploitation. The room was packed. Students whispered afterward, brows furrowed, theories forming like cracks in glass. They started drawing their own comparisons. But one even asked during a Q&A, is it possible for a synthetic voice to pass as an original if it's trained on someone else's trauma? I tilted my head, let silence hang. Then I answered, only if the world prefers the echo to the scream. Later that evening, I found a note slipped under my door. Handwritten, careful. I read Embervale's first manuscript again. I think you're right. She doesn't sound like herself. She sounds like someone else, someone who's stopped writing. No signature. But I didn't need one. The tide was shifting. All I had to do was hold the current steady. At night, I sat in my temporary office and reread the last page of The Last Ember. The fake ending, the one Rowan crafted like a lullaby. Cassia walks into the fire again, but this time, she thanks the flame for the warmth. I closed the book gently, like closing a casket. I whispered, I never thanked the fire, I just survived it. Let her think I've gone quiet. Let her sip her champagne in someone else's spotlight. I'm not gone. I'm rewriting the stage cues. I filed a request to host a public symposium. Topic: Resurrected Voices, the Cost of Revival in Modern Narrative. The dean approved it with little resistance. Embervale was invited to speak as the representative of synthetic-authored trauma literature. A perfect bait. All that remained now was the spotlight. And the truth, I'd pour into it like gasoline. The auditorium lights had been dimmed to an ambient amber, casting shadows along the mahogany walls of Varellis's oldest hall, the kind of light that flatters memory and forgives detail, perfect for illusions, perfect for performance. The stage was clean, the backdrop bare, just one lectern, one microphone, one truth waiting to be spoken aloud. The symposium had been announced weeks ago under the title Resurrected Voices, the Cost of Revival in Modern Narrative. A gentle name, almost poetic, just ambiguous enough to pass as academic, just pointed enough to draw blood. The guest list was curated with surgical precision: rising authors, literary critics, neural sync engineers, and of course, Embervale, the face of synthetic authored survivor literature. The woman who'd redefined trauma for the sake of story. The woman who'd rewritten me. The woman I was about to unmask. She confirmed attendance within 48 hours. Honored, her assistant had written. Ms. Vale is thrilled to speak on embodiment and the fusion of authorship. Thrilled. How fitting. I stood in the foyer as guests began to trickle in, the soft thrum of conversation building like the overture to something operatic. I wore black, simple, structured. No flair, no color. I wanted the room to see me as a frame, not the portrait, because she was the portrait. And she arrived wearing red. Not just any red, the red, the exact shade I'd worn the night of our final award ceremony, before the fire, before the world turned her into ashes and me into silence. Crimson silk that shimmered like threat and memory. The neckline dipped just enough to hint, not enough to confess. Her hair pulled back, her eyes sharp, controlled. A performance perfected. When she entered, the room shifted, just slightly, like the wind tilting toward a storm no one was ready to name. I watched her scan the crowd, her gaze moving past me at first, not recognizing the version of Cassia that didn't flinch. Then she saw me, and smiled, like we were still girls trading secrets over wine-soaked drafts. Like nothing had burned. "Kasha," she said, approaching with a tilt of her head. "You've always been so supportive." She said it smoothly, warmly, like the dagger hadn't already been pressed to my ribcage. I handed her a glass of champagne. Steady hands, steady voice. "Sportive," I echoed. "Like scaffolding, something you tear down once the set is built." Her smile faltered, just for a breath, a flicker. Then it returned, thinner now, more polished. She sipped. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said. I raised an eyebrow. "And yet you wore my dress." She laughed softly. "Some stories are worth resurrecting, don't you think?" I leaned in, voice quiet but carved in stone. "And some ghosts return to finish them." For a heartbeat, we just stood there. Performer and mirror. Story and source. Her gaze flicked down to the name tag pinned at my side. May Arden, the alias that had taught an entire class how to spot a forgery hiding in flawless prose. "You changed your name," she murmured. "So did you," I said. Her fingers tightened slightly around the glass. "We all evolve." I didn't blink. "No, you construct it, that's different." The silence that followed was thick, intimate, in the worst way. She turned from me before I could say more, swept into a swirl of admirers and faculty members eager to be near her gravity. I watched her pose for photos in front of the Virelli's banner, watched her laugh as if her fiction hadn't come at the cost of my reality. The nerves should have come then, but they didn't. I wasn't afraid of her anymore, because for the first time I saw her not as a flame, but as a mask. One I was about to rip away. Backstage, I pulled out the pages I'd prepared. Not a lecture, not an essay. Just a voice. My voice. Raw and unread by anyone else until now. I ran my fingers across the final line. The one that would snap the spell. I waited until she stepped onto the stage, her presence elegant and poised, a red silhouette against sterile light. She began her speech with practiced ease, speaking on narrative evolution, the ethics of emotional translation, and how AI can elevate the soul of the story when paired with authentic resonance. They applauded her language. They didn't see the corpse beneath her feet. When it was my turn, I didn't walk to the stage, I cut toward it, each step deliberate. I didn't hold notes. I didn't smile. I stood at the lectern, met every eye, then turned slowly to face her seated on the edge of the stage. "I want to thank Ember Vale," I began, voice steady. "Her work has reshaped how we think about trauma, about who owns pain, about what stories get rewritten and why." I hummed through the crowd, curious, confused. "She taught us," I continued, "that when something sounds too perfect, too complete, it's probably wearing someone else's voice." Rowan's eyes narrowed. I paused. Then, let me show you what it sounds like when the story stops pretending. And I began to read. Not from her version, but from the real one. Kasha's last pages. The actual last pages, written years ago and locked away. No arc of healing, no illusion of peace, just the truth. A girl who did not forgive, who did not forget, who chose to survive without being made inspirational. A girl who walked out of the fire not with grace, but with ash still in her mouth. The audience stilled. Breaths held. Eyes turned. Toward her. And her silence screamed. The lights didn't dim when I took the stage. I asked them not to. Let them see everything, the quiver in my hands, the cold clarity in my eyes, the silence I carried like a weapon. I wasn't here to perform. I wasn't here to persuade. I wasn't even here to speak to them. I was here to take something back. No podium this time, no projection, just me, standing center stage with an old leather-bound journal pressed to my ribs, spine cracked from years of neglect. It wasn't formatted, it wasn't curated, it wasn't approved for sync reading. It was the only thing that was mine. The auditorium held its breath. Behind me, Rowan sat like a queen awaiting applause. Her dress still shimmered, her face still poised. But I could feel the tremor hiding behind her stillness, the way she glanced toward the exit lights, like they might offer sanctuary if the truth became unbearable. Too late for that. I opened the journal. No flourish, just a page, yellowed and rough, corners bitten by time. This, I said, was never meant for publication. A pause. I let the air tighten. It wasn't written for catharsis or performance. It wasn't a survival arc. It wasn't redemption. It was just the truth. The first line landed like a bruise. She didn't survive. She endured. She didn't forgive. She remembered, and she never wanted to be rewritten pretty. Whispers stirred in the crowd. A few pins stopped moving. A stylus clattered to the floor. Good. Let them hear the truth with their hands as much as their ears. I turned the page. She tried to sleep, but the fire still burned behind her eyelids. Not metaphor, not symbolism, just the memory of smoke she never got to outrun. Another page. She didn't speak in interviews because she didn't want to explain her wounds in sound bites, because grief isn't articulate, because recovery isn't symmetrical, because sometimes the strongest thing you do is not let them translate your silence into narrative. I closed the book slow, deliberate. That was the ending. No healing, no lesson, no crescendo of light. Just endurance. Just existence. I stepped forward, no longer reading. Now it was just my voice. No one asked if I wanted my story published, I said, staring directly at Rowan now. No one asked if I was ready for her to live, Cassia, the version of me who bled quietly enough to be loved. Rowan didn't move, but her eyes locked with mine, unblinking, unapologetic. I kept going. You didn't resurrect me, I said, and the microphone caught the edge of something colder in my tone. You replaced me. You gave the world a version of my pain that smiled at the end because it made them feel safe. A wave of discomfort rolled through the crowd. I saw it in the slow shifting of bodies, the furrowed brows, the sudden realization that maybe they hadn't read a novel at all, but an obituary dressed in fiction. I know about the blend, I continued. Veritas ID 317, B47, my neural imprint. 51% hers, 2% synthetic thread lift, just enough to make the illusion smooth. Baths now. Someone in the back murmured, impossible. But I had proof. I pulled up the sync data from my wristband, projected it in real time across the stage wall. Neural rhythm spikes, cadence charts, sentence architecture overlays all matched, side by side. I raw journal, the last ember. Identical, except for the ending. And in that difference lived the theft. The Veritas system passed it because the machine doesn't know betrayal, but you do, I said, turning back to the audience. All of you. You've read a lie and thanked it for being beautiful. I looked back to Rowan. She was pale now, still smiling, but only with her mouth. She rose from her seat slowly, and for a moment I thought she would defend herself. But instead, she whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "They believed in me." I nodded. They believed in the version of me that didn't make them uncomfortable. I stepped down from the stage, walking toward her, journal still in hand. "This wasn't about writing," I said, my voice barely above a breath. "This was about authorship. You didn't steal my words, Rowan. You stole my right to say how they ended." She opened her mouth, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to retaliate, but I raised a hand to stop her. "You don't get to speak here." I turned back to the crowd. "You wanted closure, I gave you the cost." I walked out of the spotlight as the room erupted behind me, not in applause, not in outrage, but in something far more satisfying. She'd out. The sound of a lie crumbling beneath the weight of its own performance. The news broke before I left the building. Veritas announced an emergency audit. Embervale's licensing had been temporarily suspended pending an investigation. The literary panel released a joint statement calling for greater scrutiny of derivative emotional sync blends. A trending thread titled, "Whose Pain Was It?" surged across the feed, and my real name, Casa Vale, was suddenly no longer buried in citations but etched in fire across the headlines. Rowan didn't look at me when they escorted her from the side door. She wore red again, but this time it didn't shimmer. It clung, like blood refusing to dry. I didn't stay for the press interviews. I didn't want to explain anything, not to people who had once loved the lie more than they were ever willing to question it. I slipped out through the back corridor, beneath the university's etched steel archway, and into the night that had finally decided to rain. A quiet rain, not dramatic, just enough to soften the concrete and blur the streetlights. I walked without purpose for the first time in years, and it felt like breathing. There was no celebration, no rush of vindication. Just a stillness in my bones, like something that had been clenched inside me had finally let go. Not release, not peace, just stillness. I had expected the world to end the moment I told the truth. But it hadn't. It had simply tilted. I found myself outside a small cafe. Not the kind that had smart menus or hollow waiters. Just a place where the chairs were chipped and the coffee tasted slightly burnt. I went inside, sat near the window, and pulled out the journal. The real one, the one I used to write in with hands that trembled too much to type. I turned to the last blank page. My pen hovered for a moment, and then I wrote. The story did not end when she survived. It didn't end when they tried to make her smile. It didn't end when they turned her grief into comfort. It began the moment she spoke, unpretty and unpolished, and no one could rewrite her for it. It wasn't prose. It was declaration. A few days later, the emails began. Some anonymous, some signed with initials I hadn't read in years. A former student wrote, "I dropped my pen when you said she didn't forgive." A reviewer whispered, "I think I've published lies. You made me realize they had names." A reader, only 16, sent a single sentence, "Thank you for letting her stay angry." It wasn't a flood, but it was enough. I started teaching again, quietly, not as May Arden anymore, but as Cassia. Not at Varellis. I chose a smaller place. No banners, no statues, just a round table where no one called pain beautiful unless they'd bled for it themselves. And I didn't teach fiction. I taught reclamation. I taught silence as resistance, rage as record, truth as a page that could cut deeper than any pen. Rowan didn't fight the ruling. She vanished again, this time without flames. Embervale was delisted across all major platforms, her titles withdrawn. But I knew she wouldn't stay gone. She would reinvent, rebrand, rebuild, because that's what she'd always done. But this time, she would not do it using me, because the story she thought she finished, it had only been the prologue. One afternoon, during office hours, a girl knocked on my door. Nervous, twisting the sleeve of her coat. She sat down without speaking, then finally asked, "What happens if someone tries to write me before I've finished?" I looked at her, really looked at her. Her eyes were cautious but alive, like someone who had walked too far into someone else's narrative and just realized she could turn around. I set down my pen and leaned forward. "Then don't beg to be in their story," I said. "Start one they can't erase." She exhaled like that was the answer she'd been needing for years. Later that night, I sat alone in my small apartment. The walls still bare, the windows still a little drafty, but something in the air felt different now, like the pause between chapters. Not an ending, just a breath. I reached for a new notebook. Clean pages. No lines. And I began again. No title, no outline. Just one sentence. They wrote me as a footnote, but I took the pen, and now I only write beginnings. Not every story needs to end in forgiveness. Some stories exist to remember, to reclaim what was taken, and to speak without smoothing the edges. This is a story about authorship, identity, and the quiet power of refusing to be rewritten. So tell us, have you ever felt like someone else tried to define your story before you were ready to speak? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If you felt seen by this story, like, share, and subscribe for more stories written for those who were silenced but never erased.